For over 2 decades, Mary Thompson harbored a dark secret, a betrayal by her own son that shattered her life. After 21 years of silence and meticulous planning, she sought revenge. But when the moment finally arrived, it came with a deadly twist no one saw coming. The small town of Roseville, North Carolina, was a place where everyone knew each other, a tight-knit community that rarely saw much crime. It was the kind of town where secrets were supposed to stay buried. But on the evening of July 15, 2021, one such secret began to unravel in the most shocking way imaginable. At the center of this tale is Mary Thompson, a seemingly ordinary woman who had lived in Roseville all her life. She was known for her quiet demeanor, never one to stir trouble, always the first to lend a hand to a neighbor. But what most people didn't know was that Mary had been carrying a dark burden for over 2 decades. A burden that began in 2000, the year her son, Daniel, committed a betrayal so deep, it shattered her world. Daniel Thompson, her only child, had once been the pride of her life. Smart, charming, and well-liked, Daniel had a bright future ahead of him. But that all changed when, at the age of 21, he was implicated in a scandal that tore apart not just their family, but the entire town. Mary never spoke of the details of this betrayal, not to friends, not to family. It was a wound that festered in silence. But what Roseville didn't know was that for 21 years, Mary harbored a secret plan, a plan for revenge. The first signs of trouble surfaced in the late spring of 2000. Daniel had recently graduated from college and had returned home to help with the family business. But beneath his charismatic exterior, Daniel was hiding a secret, a business deal gone wrong that would plunge his family into financial ruin. He had made a series of illegal transactions, deceiving not only his own family, but also their closest friends. Mary had trusted her son completely, never suspecting that the person she loved most in the world could betray her in such a profound way. The discovery came in the most devastating manner. One evening, while going through the company's financial records, Mary stumbled upon the discrepancies. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but the more she dug, the clearer it became. Her son had been stealing from the family business, siphoning off money to fund his own reckless ventures. Her heart broke that day. She confronted Daniel, but instead of remorse, he offered only excuses. He claimed he had done it to protect the family, that the money he had taken would have been returned. But Mary knew better. The trust was gone. The damage was irreparable, not just to their finances, but to their relationship. She had lost not just her son, but her faith in him. For Mary, this betrayal was not something she could simply forgive. The shame of what Daniel had done spread like wildfire through Roseville. Once a well-respected family, the Thompsons became the subject of hushed whispers and gossip. The betrayal didn't just cost Mary her financial stability, it cost her her standing in the community. But instead of lashing out, Mary did something that no one expected. She stayed quiet, and she waited. For the next 21 years, Mary Thompson lived a life of quiet routine. Outwardly, she seemed to accept her fate. She sold the family business to cover the debts Daniel had incurred and lived off the small pension that was left. But anyone who knew her could tell that something had changed. The once vibrant woman, who was always seen with a smile, had become a shell of her former self. She rarely socialized, and when she did, there was a coldness about her that made even her closest friends uneasy. Daniel, on the other hand, left Roseville soon after the scandal. He moved across the country, settled down, and started a new life. Occasionally, people would ask Mary how he was doing, but her responses were always short, vague, and distant. There was no contact between mother and son. Daniel had become a ghost, a distant memory that she never spoke of. But the betrayal never left Mary. Each day, as she went through her routines, it gnawed at her, an unhealed wound that time couldn't touch. She remembered the sleepless nights, the shame she felt every time she walked through the streets of her small town, and the pain of knowing that her only child had chosen greed over his own family. Years passed, but Mary's feelings of betrayal only deepened. She watched as life moved on without her. Friends who once visited regularly stopped coming. Her once busy home became quiet, the sound of Daniel's laughter a distant memory. And through it all, Mary stayed silent, holding on to the bitterness and resentment that had grown within her. But Mary was not just grieving, Beneath the surface, she was planning. 21 years is a long time, and in those years, she never stopped thinking about how she would make Daniel pay for what he had done. At first, the thoughts of revenge were fleeting, something that would pass. But as the years went by, those thoughts became more frequent, more detailed. She thought about confronting him, about exposing him to his new life, about making him feel the pain she had endured for so long. As time went on, Mary's plan became clearer. She had waited long enough. Now she was ready to act. By 2021, Mary had become a master of patience. For years, she had waited for the right moment, slowly crafting her plan in secret. But this was not the reckless revenge of someone acting on impulse. It was something far more calculated. Mary knew she couldn't just confront Daniel outright. After all, he had built a new life far from Roseville, and any public confrontation would likely end in more humiliation for her. No, her revenge had to be precise. It had to be something he never saw coming. In the years leading up to 2021, Mary had gathered every piece of information she could about Daniel's new life. She found out where he lived, who he associated with, and most importantly, what weaknesses he had developed over the years. It wasn't difficult. Daniel had become somewhat successful in his new town, but success didn't mean he had changed. He was still reckless, still making risky business deals, and still gambling with other people's trust. But the one thing that caught Mary's attention was his personal life. Daniel had remarried and had 2 children of his own. It was ironic, Mary thought. The very person who had destroyed his own family now had a new one, pretending to be a respectable man. But behind the facade of his perfect life, there were cracks. Daniel's marriage wasn't as solid as it appeared, and he had developed a gambling addiction that was slowly spiraling out of control. His new wife had no idea of the financial mess he had been making behind closed doors, and his children were too young to understand the gravity of their father's secret. This was the leverage Mary had been waiting for. She knew that Daniel's new family was his greatest vulnerability. If she could find a way to expose his deception, the entire life he had built would come crashing down. But that wouldn't be enough. Mary didn't want just to ruin him. She wanted him to feel the same helplessness, the same betrayal that she had felt all those years ago. And for that, she needed to make sure he was trapped with no way out. The plan was set in motion when Mary hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Daniel's finances. The investigator quickly confirmed what Mary had suspected. Daniel was on the verge of financial collapse. His gambling debts had reached a point where even his new family's stability was at risk. If his wife ever found out, it would destroy him. With this information, Mary began to put her plan into action. She started by contacting Daniel under a false pretense, pretending to be someone from his past who had come into new information about his business dealings. At first, Daniel was dismissive, not recognizing the voice on the other end of the line. But as Mary hinted at the nature of her information, he grew more interested, and then more desperate. The day of the confrontation arrived on a quiet summer afternoon in early August. By this time, Daniel had already agreed to meet with Mary, although he still had no idea it was her. She had arranged everything meticulously, using the private investigator to secure a secluded location for the meeting. She had chosen a spot on the outskirts of his town, far from prying eyes, somewhere she could have the conversation that had been brewing for over 2 decades. As Daniel pulled up to the meeting spot, he was nervous. The cryptic phone calls over the past few weeks had left him uneasy. The voice on the other end had hinted at knowledge of his financial troubles and even some of his past transgressions. He had been careful, or so he thought, but someone had found out, and now he needed to find out who. When Daniel stepped out of his car, he didn't recognize the woman waiting for him at first. She was older now, her face lined with years of grief and anger. But as she turned to face him fully, a wave of shock passed over him. It was his mother. "Mom?" Daniel's voice was filled with disbelief. He hadn't seen her in years, and the last thing he expected was to see her here, now under these circumstances. Mary stood there silent for a moment, her cold eyes fixed on him. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, the reality of it was overwhelming. She wasn't sure how he would react. Would he try to apologize? Would he beg for forgiveness? Or would he continue with the same arrogance he had shown her years before? "Surprised to see me, Daniel." Mary's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of bitterness that Daniel could not ignore. He didn't know what to say. The guilt that he had buried for years began to rise to the surface, but his instinct was to defend himself. "Mom, I didn't know you would be here. What is this about?" he stammered, trying to compose himself, but the panic was already setting in. Mary took a step closer, her face betraying no emotion. "What this is about? This is about the 21 years I've spent waiting, Daniel. Waiting for the moment when I could finally make you understand what you did to me, what you did to our family." Daniel's face paled. He had expected someone from his past to come after him for his financial mistakes, but he hadn't expected this. His own mother, after all these years, still held on to the betrayal. He tried to deflect, to offer an explanation, but the words caught in his throat. "Mom, But Mary wasn't interested in his excuses anymore. The time for talking was over. For 21 years, she had waited for this moment, and now that it was here, Daniel was going to face the consequences. "I trusted you," she said, her voice firm. "I gave you everything, and you threw it all away. Do you even understand the damage you caused? The lives you ruined? And now you're doing it again, with this new family of yours." Daniel was silent, his mind racing. How did she know about his financial situation? How did she know about his new life, his wife, his children? But before he could ask, Mary delivered the final blow. "I've spent 21 years planning this, Daniel, and now it's time for you to feel the same betrayal." Daniel stood frozen, the weight of his mother's words sinking in. The realization of what was happening hit him like a cold wave. For over 2 decades, Mary had lived with this betrayal, and now she was here to settle the score. He had thought he had moved on, built a new life, but he couldn't have been more wrong. His past had finally caught up with him, and it had come in the form of his mother, someone he never expected to be his adversary. As Daniel scrambled to regain control of the situation, Mary remained calm and unflinching. She had the upper hand, and she knew it. She had spent years preparing for this moment, and every detail had been carefully planned. "You think you're invincible, don't you, Daniel? That no one can touch you? You've gotten away with everything for years, but that ends now," Mary said, her voice steady, filled with cold resolve. Daniel's mind raced. He had dealt with dangerous situations before, gambled with his life and money, but this was different. This was personal. His own mother stood before him, and he could see that she wasn't bluffing. This was a side of her he had never seen before, and it terrified him. "What are you going to do?" Daniel finally managed to say, his voice shaky. Mary didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. It was thick, stuffed with papers and photographs. She tossed it onto the hood of his car. "Open it," she commanded. Daniel hesitated, but he reached for the folder and opened it. Inside were pages of documents, printouts of his bank transactions, photos of him meeting with shady characters, and evidence of his gambling debts. There were even photos of his new family, his wife and children. His stomach dropped as he realized just how much she knew. "I've been watching you," Mary said, her voice taking on a chilling calmness. "Every step you've taken since you left me, I've known about it. Your debts, your lies, your business failures. And now, I have all the proof I need to bring your entire world crashing down." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He had always been good at talking his way out of difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't some business rival or creditor. This was his mother, and she was holding all the cards. "I can fix this," Daniel blurted out, desperate to find a way out. "I just need some time. I can pay off the debts. I can—" "Time?" Mary's voice rose sharply for the first time. "You've had 21 years, Daniel. 21 years to make this right. But you didn't. You chose to run. You chose to start over, to pretend like nothing happened. You betrayed me once, and now you've betrayed this new family of yours. Do you really think you deserve to fix anything?" Daniel felt a deep pit forming in his stomach. He knew she was right. He had spent his life running from one mistake to the next, always hoping that he could outrun his past. But now there was nowhere left to run. Mary stepped closer, her eyes locked on him. "Here's what's going to happen." she said, her voice ice cold. You're going to walk away. You're going to leave this town, leave your family, and disappear. And if you don't, I will destroy you. I will make sure that your wife, your children, and everyone you know sees you for what you really are. A fraud, a liar, and a coward. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He could barely process what was happening. She wasn't just asking for revenge. She was asking him to erase himself from his new life entirely. It was the ultimate punishment. He would lose everything without a fight. You can't do this, Daniel stammered, trying to find some way to reason with her. I'm your son. You stopped being my son the day you betrayed me, Mary replied coldly. Now you're just another man who needs to be dealt with. As the weight of Mary's ultimatum settled over Daniel, he realized just how much danger he was in. His mother had orchestrated everything with terrifying precision. She had him backed into a corner, and he knew that she wasn't bluffing. If he didn't comply, she would follow through on her threat. His life, as he knew it, would be over. You're serious, Daniel muttered, more to himself than to her, as he flipped through the documents once more. The evidence she had gathered was damning. Every secret, every lie he had told was laid bare in front of him. Mary had thought of everything, his family, his business associates, his debts, and she had enough information to ruin him completely. I've never been more serious in my life, Mary replied, her voice devoid of any emotion. I don't want to hurt you, Daniel, but you need to understand, you left me no choice. You destroyed me once. Now it's your turn to feel that pain. Daniel felt trapped. He had never expected his mother to be capable of something like this. He had underestimated her, just like he had underestimated everyone else in his life. He had always assumed he could manipulate his way out of any situation, but there was no talking his way out of this one. Mary could see the conflict in his eyes, the realization that his time had run out. She didn't need to press any further. The documents spoke for themselves. The only thing left was for Daniel to make a decision. Here's how this works, she continued, her voice calm but firm. You're going to pack your things tonight and leave. No goodbyes, no explanations. You disappear and you don't come back. If you stay, I will go to the police. I will expose everything. And you know as well as I do that your family will never look at you the same way again. Daniel stood there, silent, as the weight of his mother's words sank in. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. There was no escape, no easy solution. His mother had turned the tables on him, and now he was the one left scrambling for survival. And what if I don't go? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a desperation in his eyes that Mary hadn't seen before, but it didn't move her. She had spent 21 years preparing for this moment, and nothing he could say would change what she was about to do. Mary stared at him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Then you'll lose everything, she said simply, and this time, there will be no second chances. Daniel stood motionless, his mind racing through every possible scenario. His life, everything he had built, was on the line, and his own mother was holding the knife. He tried to muster a response, but the cold certainty in Mary's voice had left him speechless. There was no bargaining, no room for negotiation. She was giving him two choices: disappear forever or be exposed as the fraud he truly was. For a moment, Daniel considered running. He thought about grabbing the folder of evidence, destroying it, and walking away. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Mary had made sure to cover every angle. Even if he took the documents, she would have backups. He could flee the meeting, but there would be no escaping the consequences. The crushing weight of his situation began to sink in, and Daniel felt the walls closing in around him. He had spent years avoiding responsibility, leaving behind one mess after another, but now there was nowhere left to run. He was cornered, and this time, it was by the person who had once loved him more than anyone else. Please, Mom, he began, his voice cracking with desperation. You don't have to do this. I can fix it. I can make things right. I just need time. Mary's face remained unmoved, her cold resolve unwavering. Time? Daniel, I gave you time. 21 years of it. And what did you do with it? You ran. You lied. You left me behind to deal with the mess you created. Daniel took a step closer, his hands trembling. But I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was young. I made mistakes. I didn't know what I was doing. Mary let out a bitter laugh, a sound that echoed in the empty lot where they stood. Mistakes? This isn't about being young, Daniel. You knew exactly what you were doing when you betrayed me. And then you did it again, with your new family, your lies, your debts. You never stopped. Her words cut deep, and Daniel felt the sting of truth in them. He had never taken responsibility for what he had done. He had always found a way to deflect, to blame others, to hide behind his charm and excuses. But now, standing in front of his mother, he realized there was no more hiding. "What do you want me to do?" Daniel asked, his voice hollow. He already knew the answer, but part of him still clung to the hope that there might be some way to escape his fate. "I already told you," Mary replied, her voice as cold as ever. "You leave. Tonight. No one ever hears from you again. You disappear, and you don't take anything with you. Not your family, not your money. Nothing. Or," she paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air, "I make sure the world knows who you really are." Daniel stood there, trapped between two impossible choices. Either way, he was about to lose everything. But the thought of leaving his family, his wife, his children, was unbearable. Could he really walk away from them without a word? Could he live with himself knowing that he had abandoned them just as he had abandoned his past? But then again, what other option did he have? If Mary followed through with her threat, it would be even worse. His wife would leave him, his children would grow up despising him, and he would be left with nothing but the ruins of the life he had tried so hard to build. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: guilt, fear, anger, and regret. But in the end, he knew what he had to do. He had no choice. "All right," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go. Tonight." Mary watched him carefully, her eyes narrowing as she took in his words. "Good," she said, her tone flat and emotionless. "You've made the right decision." But even as the words left her mouth, there was no satisfaction in her eyes. This was not a victory for her. It was simply the end of a long, painful chapter. And now the final act was about to unfold. That night, Daniel made preparations to leave his life behind. He packed a single bag, careful not to alert his wife, Michelle, or his two young children. His hands trembled as he zipped the bag shut, knowing that this would be the last time he would see his home, his family, and everything he had worked for over the past 2 decades. The weight of his decision bore down on him with crushing force. He left a note for Michelle, vague and full of empty apologies, explaining that he had to leave for reasons she wouldn't understand. He knew she would be devastated, but it was better than her discovering the full truth. He couldn't bear the thought of her looking at him with the same disgust and hatred that Mary now felt. As he crept out of the house in the dead of night, his heart pounded in his chest. The silence of the empty streets felt suffocating, as if the whole world knew what he had done and was watching him leave. He had thought of every possible way out of this, but the reality was inescapable. His mother had won. He would have to disappear, just as she had demanded. But Daniel didn't know that Mary's plan had one final, deadly twist. As he drove down the highway, heading toward a destination unknown even to him, Daniel's mind was a blur of thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that this couldn't be the way his life ended. He had always managed to find a way out before, and part of him still believed that he could find one now. He didn't notice the car following him at first. It wasn't until he had left the town limits, driving along a deserted stretch of road, that he saw the headlights in his rearview mirror. They had been there for miles, matching his every turn, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion. At first, Daniel brushed it off as coincidence, but as the miles passed, the car remained behind him, never overtaking him, never falling behind. A sense of unease crept over him, and he began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the car sped up, closing the gap between them. Daniel's pulse quickened, and panic surged through him. Who was following him? Could it be someone connected to his gambling debts? Was this part of Mary's plan? His thoughts were cut short when the car slammed into the back of his vehicle, jolting him forward in his seat. His heart raced as he fought to control the steering wheel. He pressed down on the gas, trying to escape. But the other car was relentless, ramming into him again and again, forcing him off the road. Daniel's car skidded across the pavement, tires screeching as it veered toward the edge of the highway. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car swerved violently and plunged into a ditch, crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. Everything went black. Daniel awoke to the sound of his own labored breathing. His head throbbed, and his body ached from the impact of the crash. His car was mangled, the front end crumpled against the tree, and the windshield shattered. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and the airbag hung deflated in front of him. Disoriented, he tried to move, but pain shot through his chest, forcing him to gasp for breath. He struggled to focus, his vision blurry and his thoughts muddled. For a few moments, he couldn't remember where he was or how he had ended up here. But then it all came flooding back. His mother's ultimatum, his desperate escape, and the car that had forced him off the road. As he tried to sit up, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked toward the road, where the car that had run him off the highway was now parked. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking slowly toward him. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief as the figure came into view. It was his mother. Mary stood there, watching him struggle in the wreckage of his car, her expression unreadable. For a moment she said nothing, simply observing him with a cold, detached gaze. Then she spoke, her voice calm and deliberate. "You didn't think I would just let you walk away, did you?" Daniel stared at her, his mind racing with confusion and fear. "Mom, what are you doing?" he managed to choke out, his voice weak. Mary took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You thought disappearing would be enough, that I would just let you go and let you start over again. But you don't get to leave, Daniel. Not after everything you've done." Panic surged through Daniel as he realized the full extent of his mother's plan. This wasn't just about making him disappear. She had never intended to let him walk away. This was her final act of vengeance, a deadly twist in a plan that had been in motion for 21 years. You're going to kill me?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. Mary didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked closer to the wrecked car, her face calm and emotionless. "I'm not going to kill you, Daniel," she said quietly. "You did this to yourself. All I did was make sure you had no way out." Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he struggled to comprehend what she was saying. His body trembled as the realization hit him. The crash, the setup, it had all been part of her plan. She had orchestrated everything, down to the last detail, ensuring that Daniel would have no way to escape. "You see, I gave you a choice," Mary continued, her voice steady. "But you never could make the right one. You've spent your whole life running from your mistakes, but now there's nowhere left to run." Daniel tried to plead with her, but his words came out in broken gasps. "Please, Mom, I'll leave. I'll go. I swear." Mary's expression softened for a moment, but not with sympathy. Instead, it was the look of someone who had finally completed a long and painful journey. She crouched down next to the wrecked car, her eyes locking with his. "You've already left," she whispered. She stood up, turned away from him, and began walking back toward her car. Daniel's heart raced as he tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. His vision blurred again, and his breathing became shallow. He could hear the sound of Mary's car engine starting, and he knew there was nothing more he could do. As Mary's car pulled away, leaving him alone in the dark, Daniel felt the cold grip of terror closing in. This was the end. He had run out of time, and there was no escape. The next morning, the wreckage of Daniel's car was discovered by a passerby. Local authorities were called to the scene, but by the time they arrived, Daniel was already gone. His body, battered and broken, was slumped in the driver's seat, lifeless. The official report would later attribute the crash to speeding, citing the skid marks and impact as evidence that Daniel had lost control of the vehicle. There was no mention of foul play, no indication that anyone else had been involved. It was simply an accident, another tragic story of a man whose life had spiraled out of control. But for Mary, it was something far different. It was the final chapter in a story of betrayal and revenge, a story that had consumed her for more than 2 decades. She had gotten what she wanted. Daniel was gone, and his secrets had died with him. In the weeks that followed, Mary returned to her quiet life in Roseville. She went about her days as she always had, attending church on Sundays, tending to her garden, and exchanging pleasantries with her neighbors. To anyone looking in from the outside, she was just a grieving mother who had lost her son in a tragic accident. But inside, Mary felt nothing. The satisfaction she had expected to feel was absent, replaced only by a hollow emptiness. The revenge she had spent years planning had brought no peace, no closure. She had won, but the victory was bitter, and the cost was far higher than she had ever anticipated. She had avenged her son's betrayal, but in doing so, she had lost herself. The woman she had once been, the mother who had loved Daniel unconditionally, was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. As time went on, the town of Roseville moved on, and Daniel's death became just another story, whispered about but soon forgotten. And Mary, once again, became a figure of mystery, a woman with secrets buried deep beneath the surface. The echoes of her revenge would fade, but for Mary the memories would remain, haunting her every step. She had spent 21 years waiting for justice, but in the end all that was left was the shadow of what could have been, and the unshakable truth that sometimes even the darkest plans lead to nothing but more darkness. And so, in the quiet town of Roseville, a mother lived out the rest of her days, haunted by the very revenge she had so carefully sought. In the end, Mary Thompson's long-awaited revenge brought no peace, only a hollow victory. The son she sought to punish was gone, but the darkness of her actions lingered. What was meant to be justice became a reminder that some wounds, once opened, never truly heal.